Hey friends, I'm the storyteller. Before you get too comfortable, do me a small favor, hit like and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy this kind of storytelling. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far these stories reach. Karen Buckley was born in 1991, the beloved first child of John and Marion Buckley. She would later become the proud big sister to 3 younger brothers, making her the eldest in a close-knit family of 6. She was raised in Mourne Abbey, a quiet, rural patch of countryside in County Cork, tucked away in the southwest of Ireland. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, a farming community filled with familiar faces, where neighbors became lifelong friends and kids played together without worry. Life there was simple, warm, steady. And Karen was a reflection of that. She wasn't flashy or loud, she was genuine. She was known by everyone in the village as a kind, gentle, and deeply caring soul, someone who would always stop to ask how you were, someone who remembered the little things. She was sensitive but strong, thoughtful but ambitious. Her friends described her as someone who was easy to be around. No drama, no fuss, just a really good person with a heart that made space for everyone. Karen was also incredibly family-oriented. Her parents and brothers were her whole world. They were a tight family unit full of love and laughter. Weekends and evenings were often spent at their local Gaelic club, where Karen and her brothers played Gaelic football for Clodagh Rovers. It wasn't just sport, it was tradition. It was togetherness. And Karen? She was a hard worker. From an early age, she showed drive. She excelled in school, always pushing herself, always aiming higher. But more than anything, she knew what she loved: helping people. It came naturally to her, the empathy, the gentleness, the patience. And so it made perfect sense when she decided to pursue a career in nursing. She enrolled at the University of Limerick, determined to build a future, doing what she was best at, caring. To her, nursing wasn't just a job, it was a calling. During her time at university, Karen took on a part-time job as a waitress at the Hibernian Hotel and Pub, a local spot not far from home. And even there, among trays and late shifts, Karen left a lasting impression. Her coworkers would later describe her as a ray of light, someone who was always smiling, always lifting the mood. Even on days when she wasn't feeling her best, when she was tired, ill, or quietly going through something, she never let it show. She always had that same smile, that same warmth. She was the kind of person who could make other people feel better, even when she was struggling herself. And beyond school and work, Karen had a deep love for travel. She took every opportunity she could to explore the world, both during her time at university and after she graduated. She traveled to Thailand, South America, and other places that gave her a glimpse into different cultures, different ways of living. It wasn't about luxury, it was about experience, growth, connection. Karen wanted to understand people, to learn from their stories and their ways of life, and traveling gave her that. She eventually graduated with her nursing degree in the early 2010s, proud and ready to begin the next chapter. And for that first chapter of her nursing career, she made a bold move. She left Ireland for England. Karen began working as a nursing student at Princess Alexandra Hospital in Essex, and it was during her time there that something clicked. She realized she had a specific passion within healthcare, one that felt more aligned with who she was as a person: occupational therapy, helping people rebuild their lives after injury or illness, supporting their return to independence. It was exactly the kind of caring, compassionate work that suited her heart. So she began doing her research, looking up qualifications, mapping out what it would take, and she learned that to become a full occupational therapist, she'd need to get her master's degree. It was a big commitment, but Karen was ready. And the best course she could find was all the way up north in Glasgow, Scotland. In January of 2015, Karen Buckley made the move to Glasgow, Scotland, the next big step in her journey. She had enrolled at Glasgow Caledonian University, chasing her dream of becoming an occupational therapist by pursuing her master's degree. It was a fresh start in a new city, and Karen embraced it fully. She moved into a shared flat with 3 other female students, and almost instantly, they clicked. The girls were friendly, sociable, and eager to make the most of their student years. Karen fit right in. They were going out regularly, meeting new people, building friendships, living that familiar rhythm of student life, late nights, early lectures, coffee runs, and weekend plans. It was all going well, and the 11th of April, 2015, began like any other night out. The 4 of them were in high spirits, getting ready together in their flat, laughing over drinks, helping each other pick out outfits. The kind of night every student remembers fondly. Karen chose to wear a black jumpsuit, a black leather jacket, and red heels. She paid extra attention to her hair that night, curling her dark extensions and clipping them in neatly. She looked radiant, confident, ready for a good time. They were heading to Sanctuary Nightclub, a popular student spot in the West End of Glasgow. They called a taxi and arrived just before midnight. Inside, the atmosphere was lively. Loud music, crowded dance floors, bright lights. It was a typical Saturday night. Karen and her friends drank, danced, laughed. Everything felt normal. And then, around 1 a.m., something changed. Karen picked up her bag and leaned in toward her friends. "I'm just going to the toilet," she said casually. "I'll be back in a minute." They nodded, barely thinking twice. It had only been an hour since they'd arrived, so she walked off, no jacket, no goodbye, just a quick trip to the bathroom. But then, she didn't come back. Her friends waited and waited. Minutes turned into half an hour. She was still gone. At first they weren't alarmed. Maybe she'd left. Maybe something had come up. Maybe she'd run into someone and stepped outside. After all, Karen was an adult, 24 years old, and if she decided to go home, that was her choice. But something didn't feel right. She hadn't said goodbye. She left her leather jacket with them, which suggested she really was planning to return. This wasn't like her. Still, in the haze of music and alcohol, her friends tried not to panic. They continued their night, assuming maybe Karen had just made a spontaneous decision to head home. It wasn't until they returned to their flat, hours later, and found her bed still empty, that the reality of it began to sink in. Karen wasn't home. They all texted her, messaged her on every social platform they could think of. At first, they assumed maybe Karen had just gone back to a boy's flat. Maybe she'd met someone at the club and decided to go home with him. It wasn't entirely impossible, but even so, that wasn't like her. Karen was always the kind of person who let her friends know where she was. She wasn't reckless. She didn't just disappear without a word. She'd text, she'd check in. Still, they tried to reason. She had been drinking, they thought. Maybe she just forgot. But then came the morning, and Karen's bedroom door was still closed, still untouched. Her roommates opened the door. She wasn't there. Her bed hadn't been slept in, and there was still no message, no call, no post, nothing. Now, it was different. Now, it was serious. Karen's friends knew deeply, instinctively, that this wasn't just a late night or a spontaneous decision. This was completely out of character for her. She wouldn't do this. She was 24 years old. Yes, an adult, but a responsible one. She was sensible, she cared, she kept people updated, she didn't let her friends worry. So by midday, when she still hadn't shown up, when she still hadn't texted a single one of them, they made a decision. They went straight to the police station. They reported Karen missing. Officers sat down with the 3 girls and interviewed them, trying to get a sense of who Karen was, her habits, her personality, and they agreed this behavior didn't match the Karen they described. It was not like her. So, on that same day, police in Scotland contacted her parents in Ireland. They informed them that their daughter, Karen Buckley, was missing. And from that moment, the case was marked as high priority. This wasn't just a young woman who'd wandered off. Karen had vanished in the middle of the night. She was intoxicated. She was in a city she didn't know well, and now no one could find her. There were so many possibilities. Maybe she'd gotten lost. Maybe she'd fallen, gotten hurt, and couldn't get up. Maybe she'd passed out somewhere on her walk home. Maybe something had happened on the street. Or maybe something far more sinister had taken place. Maybe someone found her. Maybe someone saw her vulnerability, her drunk state, and took advantage. Right now, no one knew. No one knew where Karen Buckley could be. Within 24 hours of Karen being reported missing, her family had flown over from Ireland to Glasgow. They wasted no time. They appeared on the news, standing in front of microphones, their faces pale and hollow, pleading for help. They made public appeals, begging for anyone at all with any piece of information to come forward. Karen's face was everywhere. The story was broadcast on national television, shared across social media, passed from hand to hand like a warning, like a prayer. The police, meanwhile, were working nonstop. They issued a direct call to the public, asking for eyewitnesses, particularly anyone who had been at Sanctuary nightclub or in the surrounding West End area of Glasgow that night, to come forward and share what they saw. And it worked. Police received a tip. An eyewitness stepped forward and said that they had seen a woman they believed to be Karen Buckley standing outside of the club, speaking with a man. So investigators pulled the CCTV footage from the area outside Sanctuary. They were already planning to review it, but this tip gave them something specific to focus on. And as they combed through the grainy black and white images, they found what they believed to be Karen. The quality wasn't perfect, it never is. But in the footage, they saw a woman matching Karen's description, walking with a man, heading in the opposite direction of her flat. That raised immediate concern. Because remember, Karen had told her friends she was just going to the toilet. So what had happened? What had shifted in that small window of time between her walking toward the bathroom and now being seen outside, leaving with a stranger? And then, just 2 days into the investigation, came a chilling new development. Police received a phone call. A man, an ordinary citizen, had been out walking near a local park a few miles away from the club when he noticed something in a rubbish bin, a handbag. He opened it, looking for ID, maybe a name, a phone number, something to return it to its owner, and what he found stopped him cold. It was Karen Buckley's handbag. The one she'd taken to the club that night, just discarded, dumped in a rubbish bin. And that raised an even more disturbing question. How did it end up there? Karen wouldn't have done that herself. Why would she throw away her own handbag with her purse, her belongings, her ID? It didn't make sense. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't an accident. This looked like someone trying to dispose of evidence. With the help of eyewitnesses who had been at Sanctuary nightclub that night, police were quickly able to identify the man seen on CCTV speaking to Karen Buckley. His name was Alexander Pacteau. He was 21 years old. And so police reached out. They got in contact with Pacteau and brought him in for questioning. At this point, he wasn't being treated as a suspect. Not yet. He was simply a person of interest, the last known individual to have seen Karen after she disappeared. Maybe he could help fill in the blanks. Maybe he knew where she'd gone next. And when he arrived for questioning, he didn't raise any red flags. He wasn't anxious. He wasn't defensive. He appeared cool, calm, and collected, almost too much so. There was no panic in him. No signs of guilt, no hesitation. He answered the officer's questions directly, without stumbling. Pacteau told police that he had just met Karen that night outside the nightclub around 1 a.m. They started chatting, and they hit it off. He said that after talking for a while, he invited her back to his apartment. Karen, he said, agreed. According to Pacteau, they returned to his flat, had consensual sex, and then Karen left around 4 a.m. He claimed that she didn't stay the night, and he gave a reason for that too. He said that during their time together, Karen had hit her head on one of the bedposts in his room. He said the injury was bad, she was bleeding, felt dizzy, and had a headache. She wasn't feeling well afterward, so she decided she'd rather just go home and recover in her own space. And on the surface, the story sounded plausible. It made sense. Maybe she genuinely hurt herself and didn't want to stay the night in a stranger's flat. Maybe she'd felt uncomfortable. Maybe she just wanted to sleep in her own bed. But one detail stuck with the investigators. Pak To gave up that story, the head injury, the bleeding, the dizziness, without being asked. He volunteered for it, unprovoked. And while that doesn't automatically signal guilt, it did concern police. Because people who are trying to hide something, who are trying to steer a narrative, will often try to explain away potential red flags before they're even brought up. They'll anticipate suspicion and try to get ahead of it. So while Pak To remained calm, something in his calmness just didn't sit right. Take this, for example. If police were to search Alexander Pak To's home and happened to find Karen's blood on the bed, well, he'd already explained that in his statement. He'd already laid the groundwork for what they might find. So now it wouldn't look as suspicious, at least not on the surface. He had a reason for it. He'd claimed she hit her head. He'd described the injury. It was all there before anyone had even asked. And that's the point. If he could explain it in advance, he could make it look innocent, harmless. But here's the thing. Police are professionals. They've seen this tactic 1,000 times. They know when someone's trying to get ahead of the story, when someone's carefully planting alibis and explanations before the evidence even surfaces. So in their eyes, it didn't make him look less suspicious. It made him look more. And for that exact reason, detectives decided to secure a search warrant for Alexander Pak To's home. They were starting to feel uneasy. They couldn't put their finger on it just yet, but there was something about his behavior, his timing, his over-explanations. Something was off. While the search was being carried out, Pak To was temporarily put up at a Holiday Inn hotel under 24/7 police surveillance. Because now he was no longer just a person of interest. He was a potential suspect. And while forensic teams combed through his flat, searches continued elsewhere too. Police were now working under the growing fear that Karen Buckley might already be dead. And if that was the case, her body could be anywhere. They searched woods, fields, bodies of water, every place someone might hide something they never wanted found. But so far, nothing. Meanwhile, back at Pak To's address on Dorchester Avenue, forensic officers weren't the only ones working. Other teams of police were going door to door, speaking to his neighbors, trying to build a picture. Who was this man? Has anyone seen or heard anything strange? But interestingly, there wasn't much to go on. His neighbors barely knew him. They told police that Alexander Pak To was quiet. Not exactly a loner, not rude or unfriendly, just someone who kept to himself. He didn't socialize. He didn't chat over fences or wave from his window. And more importantly, none of them recalled seeing anything unusual on the night Karen went missing. No strange noises, no suspicious activity. No one had seen Pak To doing anything out of the ordinary. But it wasn't just the police going door to door on Dorchester Avenue that day. The press had caught wind of what was happening. They had learned that a home on the street was being searched in connection with the Karen Buckley investigation. And so they did what the press often do in high-profile cases. They swarmed the scene. At this point, police had told the media that they were focusing on one man in particular, but they hadn't yet released a name. But the press, being the press, were desperate to get that name. They wanted a headline, a front-page exclusive, a photo, a scoop. So they began conducting their own door-to-door interviews, asking neighbors, who lives in that house? What's his name? What do you know about him? And it worked. Soon the name Alexander Pak To was out. His face followed shortly after. Photos of Pak To began circulating through the press, across news sites and tabloids. It wasn't how police had wanted things to go. They weren't ready to release that information, but once it was out, there was no pulling it back. And oddly enough, this media leak ended up helping the case. Because with Pak To's name and face now public, the tips started pouring in. People began calling the police, offering leads, memories, connections, anything that might help. And one call stood out. It came from a former acquaintance of Pak To, someone who had once worked with him. This man told police that Alexander Pak To never really held down permanent jobs. He bounced from place to place, gig to gig, always floating. And years earlier, he had a side hustle. He used to illegally sell fireworks. But here's the important part. This man knew where Pac To used to store the fireworks, and he had a hunch. He said, if Pac To's trying to hide something now, it's probably going to be there. The location? A remote place called High Craigton Farm. Pac To had struck up an arrangement with the farm's owner, paying £10 a week to rent a shed space on the property. That's where he used to keep his illegal stash. The fireworks operation was long over, but the shed was still his. So police moved quickly. They secured a search warrant, mobilized a team, and made their way to High Craigton Farm. It was a vast area, open land, multiple sheds, barns, outbuildings, and everything had to be checked. And not long into their search, they spotted something, a large burn patch on the grass. It was fresh. The grass was blackened and scorched, suggesting a fire had been lit very recently. So they kept going. They searched through boxes, barrels, storage containers looking for anything. A murder weapon, a piece of clothing, a trace of Karen. And then, in one of the sheds, an officer came across a large blue plastic barrel, industrial, heavy. It had items stacked on top of it as if someone was trying to conceal it. The officer removed the items, he opened the lid, and inside, he found the body of Karen Buckley. But it wasn't just her body. It had been submerged in liquid. That liquid was later identified as sodium hydroxide, a corrosive chemical similar to acid, a substance used to dissolve organic matter. Someone had placed Karen's body inside that barrel and was trying to dissolve it, trying to erase her, trying to erase everything. For whatever reason, the chemical hadn't worked. The sodium hydroxide hadn't done what it was supposed to do. Karen's body had only barely corroded. Yes, there was damage, but not nearly as much as the killer had likely anticipated. The reaction had been slow, ineffective, and because of that, her body could be recovered. It wasn't intact, not fully, but it was enough to allow for a proper burial. It was enough to allow her family to bring her home. The body was sent for autopsy. And although the corrosion had limited what could be learned, there was one horrifying detail that couldn't be missed. Karen had been bludgeoned to death. She had been beaten, violently, brutally. Her head had multiple wounds, consistent with blunt force trauma. And though other signs were faint, they could just make out self-defense injuries along her arms and hands. Karen had fought back. She tried to defend herself. She had fought for her life. Back at High Craigton Farm, as police processed the scene, the press once again caught wind of the search and flocked to the site, cameras and notebooks in hand. One reporter claimed to have found a gold earring on the ground, supposedly one that matched the pair Karen was wearing that night. They said they recognized it from photos. Whether or not it was truly hers, that remains unclear. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. It's hard to say, because the press often race for exclusives. They want to be the ones to break the next detail, the next emotional beat. And this particular reporter had been the one to identify it as Karen's. But whether confirmed or not, the police at High Craigton Farm had seen enough. They immediately got in touch with the officers monitoring Alexander Pac To. They relayed what had just been discovered. And just like that, in the middle of a Starbucks, Alexander Pac To was arrested. That very day, Karen Buckley's parents were informed that the missing person search had now become a murder investigation. And hearing those words, that your daughter, your bright, kind, promising daughter had been murdered, it was unbearable. But to hear it in a country that wasn't your own, to be so far from family, from friends, from home, to be trapped in the very place where it had happened, that made the pain so much worse. John and Marion Buckley were now grieving in Scotland, a country they didn't know, a place where their daughter had come to build her future, and instead her life had been taken. But in the midst of that grief, something unexpected happened. Scotland came together, particularly Glasgow, the city where it all took place. They opened their hearts to the Buckley family. There were memorials, candlelit vigils, moments of silence on television and at public events. News anchors and presenters showed their support on air. It wasn't just Ireland that was mourning the loss of one of their own. Scotland was mourning too, because it was someone from their community who had committed this act. One of their own who had taken the life of Karen Buckley. Her funeral in Ireland drew a massive turnout. Hundreds came. Friends, classmates, former teachers, co-workers, people from every part of Karen's life, they came to remember her, to say goodbye, to honor a woman who had touched so many. Meanwhile, Alexander Pactou was now in police custody, awaiting his first formal interview. But investigators needed to know more. Who was this man? Where had he come from? Why had he done this? To begin answering those questions, police started speaking with his friends, acquaintances, and family members, trying to build a profile, understand his personality, his habits, his day-to-day life. What they found was this. Alexander Pactou had been born into privilege. His father was French, his mother Scottish, and he was the eldest of 4 children. Growing up, he never had to struggle. He got everything he wanted. The family had money, they had comfort, they had access. Pactou was raised in luxury. He attended a private grammar school, one that required high tuition fees, a place reserved for the well-off. While at school, he played on the football team and eventually graduated with average grades. He didn't have a huge circle of friends, but he had some. He kept things small, wasn't overly social, but that in itself wasn't seen as a red flag. Many teenagers are quiet or introverted or simply still figuring themselves out. But then, in his mid-teens, things changed dramatically. His parents split up. Shortly after that, his father went bankrupt. And that mattered a lot because his father had been the primary source of the family's wealth. Suddenly, the private schools, the luxury, the security, it was all gone. Custody of Alexander and his siblings went to their mother, who was on a much lower income. They moved from comfort into a council, flat government-subsidized housing. And for Alexander Pactou, this was a major shock to the system. He had grown up with everything. Now he had nothing. He had to leave his private school because his family could no longer afford it. And he enrolled in a public school for his A-levels. But he didn't like it. He didn't fit in. And eventually he dropped out before even completing his exams. He was just 17 years old. In November of 2011, Alexander Pactou's life took another sudden turn. He was involved in a serious car accident, one so severe that he ended up in a coma for several weeks. When he eventually woke up, nothing was the same. He couldn't walk. For 6 months, he was either bedbound or in a wheelchair, fully reliant on others for even the most basic tasks. And when he did begin to recover, he had to rely on crutches for an additional year just to move around. This injury left him unable to work. Physically, he couldn't do anything strenuous. He couldn't even walk long distances, let alone hold a job. So he began claiming disability benefits from the government. During this period, somewhere in his late teens, his relationship with his mother began to break down. They started arguing more frequently. There was tension. Eventually, they mutually agreed it would be best if Alexander moved out. So, he went to live with his father. But by then, his father had already started a new life, a new girlfriend, a new household. And Pactou didn't fit in. He didn't get along with his father's partner. In fact, he felt unwelcome, like he was just in the way. And after one particularly heated argument, he decided he couldn't stay there any longer. He needed his own place. But with no income, only a small disability allowance, living alone was out of the question. So he reached out to a friend. He asked if they wanted to move in together, split rent, and that's how Pactou ended up renting that flat on Dorchester Avenue. The very flat where police would later find chilling clues. To make ends meet, Pactou occasionally sold illegal fireworks and helped out at a local garden center for some extra cash. But the money wasn't much. It was barely enough to live on. This entire period of his life was a massive fall from grace, a stark contrast to the privilege and comfort he'd grown up with. He'd gone from private schools and wealth to benefits and cheap rent, and he hated it. He resented what his life had become. But despite all of that, despite the tension at home, the collapse of his finances, the physical injury, those who knew Alexander Pactou around this time had nothing bad to say about him. In fact, they liked him. They described him as kind, charismatic, easy to get along with. He was by many accounts a funny, light-hearted person, someone you'd enjoy being around. The only thing that some friends noted as being even slightly unusual was that Pactou was often too open. He overshared. For example, he would openly talk about how he frequently hired sex workers not just in passing, but in detail. He would go to work at the garden center and tell coworkers everything. Things that most people would never dream of saying out loud. Not necessarily concerning, just odd. Not a red flag. Just strange. In fact, most of his friends referred to him as a gentle giant. And that's what made everything about this case even more disturbing. Because here was a man with a reputation for kindness, a man described as harmless, even gentle, who was now suspected of committing one of the most horrific crimes imaginable. Alexander Pactou was very tall, broad-shouldered, and strong. He looked like someone who could do damage, but no one thought he ever would. So, police decided to run Alexander Pactou's name through their database. They needed to know who they were really dealing with. Was this a first-time offender, or was there already a history? What came back made them pause. There were a few charges on his record, nothing that had ever put him behind bars, but still, they painted a picture. One of the first things they found was a charge for attempted forgery. Pactou had once printed out a batch of counterfeit banknotes, planning to put them into circulation. Fortunately, police had caught wind of it early and seized the fake notes before they hit the streets. For that offense, he was given community service. But it was another charge on his record that deeply unsettled investigators. When Alexander Pactou was just 17 years old, he had been charged with the attempted rape of a 24-year-old woman. The incident had taken place in a dark alley in the same area of Glasgow's West End where Karen Buckley had disappeared. According to police reports, Pactou had been walking one night when he bumped into the woman. They started talking. She told him she was heading home. He said he was going the same way. He suggested they share a taxi. She agreed. And together, they walked down toward the taxi rank through a narrow, unlit alleyway. That's when Pactou shoved her against the wall and tried to rape her. The woman screamed, and passersby who heard the commotion rushed to help her. Thankfully, she was able to get away before the attack escalated. She wasn't physically harmed, but it was clear what he had attempted to do. And the witnesses? They arrived just in time to see Alexander Pactou zipping up his trousers. The woman pressed charges. She took him to court. But in a stunning turn, Pactou was acquitted. He stood before the court and told the jury that he was gay and that he would never do such a thing because, as he claimed, he wasn't attracted to women. He insisted that he would never want to have sex with a woman, let alone commit sexual assault. And somehow, they believed him. That was it. That was enough. They took his word for it, and he walked out of court a free man. Pactou explained away the fact that witnesses had seen him adjusting his trousers by saying that she had attacked him first, thrown him to the ground, and that, in the fall, his belt had come undone. An excuse that frankly made no sense. But it worked. He was cleared of all charges. And what made the whole thing even more chilling was what he actually said in court. A quote that would later haunt everyone involved. He said, "I did not sexually assault this woman. I would never attempt to sexually assault a woman. I believe rape is the lowest of the low. I would rather be charged with murder than attempted rape." And he meant it. He said it under oath. He walked away from that courtroom with no punishment. But years later, as the news of Karen Buckley's murder flooded the media, as Alexander Pactou's face and name were everywhere, that woman, the survivor of that alleyway, saw it all. And she reached back out to the police to tell them her story again. She didn't want anything from it. She wasn't trying to reopen her case or draw attention to herself. She just thought maybe it would help. Maybe knowing what she'd been through, what he'd done before, would help police prove what he was capable of, help them convict him for what he had now done to Karen. At this point in the investigation, Alexander Pactou was officially in police custody, being interviewed for the first time. And just like before, he told them his timeline of events. He said the same thing he said before, that he'd met Karen Buckley for the very first time that night outside Sanctuary nightclub. They struck up a conversation. There was flirting. He invited her back to his flat. According to him, they had consensual sex. But at some point, Karen banged her head. It was an accident, nothing serious, but it made her feel dizzy and unwell. So she decided to leave. He told police she left his flat around 4 a.m. He kissed her goodbye, and that was it. He never saw her again. He had no idea what happened after that. But police knew better. They knew this version of events couldn't be true. There was too much evidence that contradicted it. They had CCTV footage. They had Karen's blood in his flat. They had her body hidden in a shed he had access to. They didn't believe him, and now they needed him to crack. So the detectives started to press him. They told him that Karen's body had self-defense wounds all over her arms and hands. They told him that someone had attacked her, and she had fought for her life. And that he, Alexander Pactou, had been the last person to see her alive. And at that point, he changed his story. He said that, yes, there had been a fight that night, a physical altercation. But he said Karen attacked him first. He claimed he was only trying to defend himself. He didn't want to hurt her. He said that's why she left. They had a disagreement. It got heated. They fought. And then she left his flat around 4 a.m., just like he said before. He insisted that something must have happened to her after she left. Maybe on her walk home, maybe someone else had found her. But at this point, Pactou could have come up with any excuse he wanted. Because the reality was this: Karen's blood was inside his flat. The two of them were seen on CCTV, walking away together. And her body was found decomposing in a shed, the same shed he'd used before to hide things from police. Still, police weren't ready to formally charge him just yet. They needed more. They wanted the full weight of the evidence before making that final move. So they seized his mobile phone, they pulled the search history, and that's when they found it. The morning after Karen had disappeared around 8 a.m., just hours after her murder, Alexander Pactou had Googled properties of sodium hydroxide, also known as caustic soda, the same corrosive chemical that Karen's body was later found submerged in. And as soon as police saw that search, the properties of sodium hydroxide, Googled just hours after Karen disappeared. That was it. That was the final piece. The last detail they needed to charge Alexander Pactou with the murder of Karen Buckley. Once he was in custody and the digital evidence was secured, investigators began putting together a timeline. They spoke to friends, Karen's flatmates, and also Pactou's anyone who might help them reconstruct the sequence of events from that night. And with that, the prosecution was finally able to piece it all together. It was Saturday, the 11th of April, 2015. Karen and her three flatmates were doing what most university students do on the weekend. They were getting ready for a night out. They had drinks at the flat, played music, laughed, took their time doing hair and makeup. It was light, fun, exactly what you'd expect from four girls heading to a club together. They left their flat at 11:45 p.m., heading to Sanctuary nightclub in Glasgow. At this point, Karen had only had a few drinks, enough to feel relaxed, maybe a bit tipsy, but she was far from intoxicated. CCTV footage from the club later confirmed this. She was walking steadily. Her speech was clear. She was sober enough to be fully aware of everything around her. Inside the club, Karen and her friends danced, chatted, had more drinks. The night was going perfectly. It was just like any other Saturday. Meanwhile, across town, 21-year-old Alexander Pactou had also been drinking. That day, 7 or 8 of his friends had gathered at his flat to pre-drink before heading out. When it came time to go to the club, they realized they'd need 2 taxis to fit everyone. The first taxi was called, filled up with a few of them, and left for Sanctuary. Pacto was in the second group, waiting behind with a couple of friends. But rather than calling a second taxi, he told them he couldn't be bothered waiting. Taxis on a Saturday night were hard to get, he said. The lines were long, so he offered to drive. This, despite the fact that he had been drinking. His friends agreed. And so, Alexander Pacto drove himself and his friends to the club under the influence. They arrived at Sanctuary and went inside like nothing had happened. They joined the rest of the group. Everything seemed normal. Then, at 1 a.m., something changed. Pacto stepped outside the club. Maybe for a cigarette. Maybe for air. He wasn't in a rush, wasn't trying to leave. He was just standing there. And around that same time, Karen Buckley also stepped out. She crossed the road, walking to the other side, maybe to find some space or fresh air herself. And that's when he saw her. That's when she was approached by a very tall man, Alexander Pacto. Karen didn't know this man. This was the first time she'd ever spoken to him. Police were able to confirm this through CCTV footage from inside the club. There had been no interaction between them before they stepped outside. They hadn't met earlier in the night. They hadn't flirted. They hadn't danced. They didn't exchange looks. They weren't seen together at all. This wasn't a case of a club hookup gone wrong. This was a random encounter. She crossed the street. He approached her. They started talking. And then they began walking together away from the club down a quiet road. We'll never know exactly what was said in that conversation. Alexander Pacto is the only person who does know, and he has never told police. But based on the CCTV footage, it's clear this wasn't romantic. There was no physical affection, no hand-holding, no arms around shoulders, no closeness at all. They looked like two strangers walking side by side. It's believed that Pacto offered Karen a lift home in his Ford Focus and she accepted. She probably thought it was just a ride, a shortcut home on a cold Glasgow night. But within 20 minutes of meeting him, Karen Buckley was dead. At first, he drove in the direction of her flat, which likely reassured her it seemed like he was genuinely taking her home. But then, a few minutes into the drive, he turned off. Down a quiet, almost deserted road. CCTV picked up his car pulling over. The Ford Focus stopped on the side of the street, and it stayed there for exactly 12 minutes and 46 seconds. That's how long the car was parked, and it's believed that during those 12 minutes, Alexander Pacto murdered Karen Buckley. As mentioned before, Karen's cause of death was bludgeoning. She had been beaten to death, struck approximately 13 times with what investigators believe to have been a large, heavy wrench. She was hit with such force that it caused a subdural hemorrhage. After the murder, Alexander Pacto didn't go home right away. Instead, he drove around for a little while, maybe to calm down, maybe just trying to figure out what to do next. Eventually, he pulled into a local park. And there, under cover of darkness, he disposed of Karen's handbag, dropped it into a public rubbish bin. Then, he got back in his car. He drove home. And by 2 a.m., he was back inside his flat. All of this from the moment Karen stepped out of the club to her being murdered and discarded had taken place in less than an hour. Once back at his flat, Pacto carried Karen's lifeless body inside. He wrapped her in a sheet, laid her on the floor, and then he went to sleep. He crawled into his bed, just a few feet away from the woman he just killed. The next morning, he woke up around 8 a.m., and immediately he began planning. He needed to get rid of the evidence. He needed to get rid of Karen's body. That's when he picked up his phone and Googled sodium hydroxide, the corrosive fluid later found in the barrel with her remains. Before he left the flat, he locked his bedroom door, the room where Karen's body still lay, so that his roommate wouldn't accidentally walk in. Then, without cleaning the blood, he got back into the same Ford Focus where he killed her and drove off. His first stop was a B&Q store, a home improvement chain here in the UK. He parked his blood-stained car right in the parking lot. It was now broad daylight. People were walking by. Anyone could have looked inside and seen the blood. But Pacto didn't seem to care. He went inside B&Q and purchased 9 liters of sodium hydroxide. along with a protective mask and a pair of rubber gloves. Then he headed to a pound stretcher, a cheap general goods shop, and bought even more of the same chemical. It was clear he was spacing out the purchases, buying from multiple shops, so as not to raise suspicion by buying too much in one place. Then he drove back home, back to the flat. He placed Karen's body in the bathtub, and he began to pour the sodium hydroxide over her naked body. He waited. He stood over her and waited, watching the chemicals. But it wasn't reacting the way he'd hoped. It was taking too long. So, in an effort to speed up the process, Alexander Pactou took a blade and made a long incision in Karen's body, all the way down her torso from the top of her chest to the bottom of her abdomen. But even after making that deep incision, the corrosion process still wasn't working fast enough. And now, time was running out. Pactou shared the bathroom with a roommate, someone who had been out all day but was due home around 8 p.m. By now, it was getting close to 5 p.m. He only had a few hours left. He knew he had to get Karen's body out of that bathtub and out of the shared space before his roommate came home. So, he gave up on the chemical disposal plan, at least for now. He began trying to bottle up the remaining sodium hydroxide from the bath, perhaps intending to use it again later. Then he did something almost surreal in its coldness. He rinsed Karen's body, dried it, and carried it back to his bedroom. And there, for the second night in a row, Alexander Pactou slept just feet away from her lifeless body. The next morning, he woke up early, around 5 a.m. He knew it was time to get rid of her body for good, and the early morning was the safest time to do it. Fewer people on the roads, fewer eyes. His first move? He drove out to a local canal and threw in the murder weapon, that large, heavy wrench that he'd used to bludgeon Karen, the same one he'd kept in his car all this time. Then, he made a few more stops. He went to Tesco and another pound stretcher, picking up supplies, not drinking alcohol, but high percentage rubbing alcohol, a lighter, some padlocks, and new clothes. And while he was in the supermarket, he casually approached one of the staff members and asked what product they recommended to get blood out of a mattress. He said this with no fear, no urgency, as if it were just another chore on his to-do list. Once home, Pactou began gathering evidence. He loaded up his car with his blood-stained mattress, the bed sheets, Karen's clothing. He then drove it all out to High Craigton Farm, the same location where her body would eventually be discovered. There, he used the rubbing alcohol and lighter to start a fire. That was the burnt patch of grass. Investigators would later find the spot where he tried to destroy the physical evidence of what he'd done. He then returned to his flat and got online. There, he ordered an industrial-sized plastic barrel, the kind used for storage or transporting chemicals. A few hours later, he went to pick it up. He brought it home, filled it with the remaining sodium hydroxide, and then he carefully placed Karen's body inside. He sealed the barrel, and he took it back out to his car. One of Alexander Pactou's neighbors would later tell police that they'd seen him struggling trying to heave a massive blue barrel into the back of his car, and it was clear why he was struggling. The barrel wasn't just large, it was heavy. It was filled with Karen's body, submerged in liters of sodium hydroxide. It was bulky, awkward, and clearly far too heavy for one person to lift easily. But eventually, after some effort, he managed to get it into his car, and then he drove back to High Craigton Farm. As mentioned earlier, Pactou had a kind of rental agreement with the farmer who owned the land. He paid about £10 a week to use one of the sheds on the property, a private, nondescript storage space. And it was there that he took the barrel. He rolled it inside the shed, positioned it in a back corner, and secured it. First, he covered it with a dirty sheet, then piled miscellaneous objects on top to make it look like just another piece of junk. A bicycle wheel, an old paper shredder, anything to make it seem like the barrel had always been there, just more clutter. Then, he closed the shed and locked it not just once, but with multiple padlocks, layering the security. And with that, he left High Craigton Farm for the final time. Later that same evening, he returned to his flat. But to his surprise, The police had already been. While he was busy moving the barrel, authorities had identified him as the man seen on CCTV speaking to Karen Buckley outside Sanctuary nightclub. They had gone to his flat around 4:30 p.m. that afternoon, but he hadn't been home. So they'd contacted his landlord, who agreed to come by with a spare key to let them in. But before police could re-enter the property, Pak To had arrived back himself. So when the officers finally entered the flat, it was with Pak To already inside. And the scene that greeted them was strange. They walked in and found Alexander Pak To scrubbing the carpets. The flat was filled with a strong smell of bleach. When he looked up and saw them, he simply said, "Oh, I was just about to come and see you." Police did a quick visual sweep of the flat, and right away, they noticed a few things that just didn't sit right. For starters, his mattress didn't fit the bed. It was the wrong size entirely. It was also bare, no sheets, no blanket. The rest of his bedroom was also oddly sparse. And the few items that were laying out in plain sight, strange. A roll of tape, a toolbox, multiple nail brushes just sitting out on surfaces. Who keeps multiple nail brushes out in their bedroom? So at this point, everything was already looking bad for Alexander Pak To, and he hadn't even officially been brought into the police station yet. But that was about to change. As police took him in for formal questioning, they also seized his car, a vital piece of this investigation since it had been used to transport Karen's body. When they searched the vehicle, they didn't find anything obvious at first. The visible blood had likely been cleaned. Any incriminating items? Removed. But that's where cadaver dogs came in. Specially trained to detect even trace amounts of human decomposition and blood, they were brought in to search the car. And the result was clear. The dogs alerted to the scent of Karen Buckley's blood inside Pak To's car. Meanwhile, forensic testing was being conducted on almost everything tied to this case. It wasn't just the car, it was the barrel, the tools, the clothing, the flat, the soil on his tires. And bit by bit, the evidence kept stacking up. They found Alexander Pak To's fingerprints on the inside of the plastic barrel. On the tires of his car, they identified a very specific type of mud, and it matched the soil at High Crichton Farm. There was no denying it. He had transported the body there. He was the one who sealed her in that barrel. The case was airtight, and Pak To knew it. With everything closing in on him, the DNA, the CCTV, the barrel, the chemical traces, the body, he knew there was no way out. And so, when it came time for his first court appearance, he made a decision. Instead of dragging it out, instead of going through a full trial, Alexander Pak To pled guilty to the murder of Karen Buckley. And that meant there was no trial. So on the 8th of September 2015, Alexander Pak To returned to court for what would be the last time. There was no need for a full trial. He had already pled guilty, but now it was time for the judge to hand down his sentence. This was Pak To's sentencing hearing. And for the first time since Karen's disappearance, he showed emotion, tears. He wept in the courtroom. A stark contrast to the version of him that investigators had gotten to know, the version that was cold, detached. Answering questions like this was just an inconvenience to his day. One of the officers who had sat across from him during those early interviews later admitted he believed Pak To was enjoying it, that he liked the attention, liked being at the center of something this big. But on that final day in court, there was no spotlight, just justice. The presiding judge addressed the courtroom and described Alexander Pak To as a callous and calculated human being. She sentenced him to life in prison with a minimum term of 23 years before he would even be eligible for parole. Legally, the minimum sentence for murder would normally be 25 years, but because Pak To had pled guilty, she was obligated by law to reduce it slightly. Still, it was life in prison. And there remains a strong possibility that he will never be released, especially given the extreme lengths he went to in an attempt to cover up the crime, the acid, the barrel, the concealment. All of it pointed to a man who thought he could erase what he'd done. At the end of that same year, Just a few months after being sentenced, Alexander Pactou attempted to appeal. He filed the request, hoping to reduce his sentence. But just days before the appeal was due to be heard in court, he withdrew it. So it never went to court. Pactou's prison life has been a misery, quite frankly. He has been targeted by other prisoners. They all hate him. They all want to harm him. He's actually been transferred prisons once for his own safety.